Good afternoon and good morning, depending where you are. Welcome to the IPP webinar today. This is the second webinar of our lunchtime series for this year. I am M.W. Chen, today's moderator for this webinar. If you're interested, you may find my bio from our notice. Today's topic is strategies for enhancing community involvement and engagement in public-private partnerships in PPP. We would like to thank our sponsor for this webinar, ATEL Engineering Group, a leading electrical and mechanical engineering service provider headquartered in Hong Kong and with operations throughout the world. It is indeed my honor and pleasure to introduce my teacher and mentor at University of Oxford, Professor Lalit Jory, who will be the speaker of this interesting and topical subject, particularly for those from Hong Kong, where we may be embarking on very major projects that will likely involve the whole community. Professor Lalit Jory, former Senior Fellow in International Business and Director of the Oxford Advanced Management and Leadership Program at Said Business School, University of Hong Kong, UK. He is the Honorary Advisor of the Institution of Public-Private Partnership in Hong Kong, advocating to create a platform for our members to maximize the PPP opportunities overseas and China. He has been an academic in the field of international business for over 45 years. Until the end of this tenure in October 2019, Lalit served as the full-time Senior Fellow in International Business and Director of the highly regarded Oxford Advanced Management and Leadership Program at Said Business School, University of Oxford. Currently, he's advising policymakers and corporate leaders in Asia. And understand Lalit is now in Bangkok. Prior to joining the University of Oxford, Lalit served as Professor of International Business at the Asian Institute of Technology, School of Management in Thailand, where he was the founding director of the school's executive MBA program. He was also a tenured professor at the University of Delhi in India. His areas of expertise include strategy and leadership in international businesses, alliances including public-private partnerships, public policy, and institutional reforms in developed and developing countries. His work examines the impact of social, political, economic, and technological shifts, strategy choices, leadership, and strategy execution practices on organization performance. So Professor Lalit will deliver his talk from Bangkok, I understand. And the topic of today is, as we said, is strategies for enhancing community involvement and engagement in PPP. And in this context, community resistance towards PPP continues to be a major hurdle in adopting PPP as a vehicle for accelerating the implementation of public projects in many countries. And this also applies to Hong Kong also. The community resistance has been observed at different stages in the PPPs, from concept to post-completion stages. In many countries, society as a whole rejects the concept of PPPs in ideological terms, and people see PPP strategy as a mechanism to privatize public services. Before we invite Professor Lalit to start his talk, I would like to also welcome participants from cities afar, including our president, who is now in Sydney, and others from the Europe and Southeast Asia, and also Middle East. And for those who like to raise questions as a management, please type via the chat in this bottom of the Zoom, and we will follow up during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Lalit Jory to start his talk. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Manvai, and welcome to all the participants from all over the world. I'm absolutely delighted to be in your company this morning, and equally delighted to talk on this subject because we are living in times when people want to exercise their rights. People want to be involved in everything. People want that the governments should engage with them before making policy decisions which affect the society as a whole. So I'm very happy that my own institution of public-private partnership in Hong Kong, led by Walter, uh, has undertaken this enterprise, an academic and a professional enterprise this morning to raise some questions about why public-private partnerships are facing resistance and opposition. Now, I do not frame resistance and opposition as negative words for me. These are most essential words for any society which wants to thrive. No government should suppress dissent or opinion. But I'm also equally concerned that if we do not address the issue of involvement and engagement, then this whole wonderful vehicle of public-private partnership might be lost, and we may not be able to complete our development agenda to the extent that we can achieve in terms of strong and healthy, and most importantly, ethical and desirable partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. So it's a very, very interesting topic, and I'm looking forward to having a dialogue with you. At Oxford, I'm used to having conversation style approach, but here we thought that I will spend about 20-25 minutes introducing some of the new, not exactly new, but some of the ongoing work that we have been doing and the recommendations that we have been making with regard to enhancing the involvement and engagement of the people. So I will spend about 20 minutes sharing some of my own thoughts and thoughts of the team which has been participating in these case study based researches. And then we will have a strong and healthy dialogue. And the whole objective of this webinar from a professional perspective is to be able to sort of strengthen the public perception about public-private partnerships as well as development in order to improve the lives of the people. And also, I'm going to share with you some of very interesting frameworks that we have developed with regard to improvement in the public perception of public-private partnerships. So at this stage, I will say a few introductory words, and then we will move over to the dialogue. Next, please. So let's start what we already know. So in 2019, the World Bank Group came out with a very nice, very comprehensive guide for helping the professionals and the policymakers in terms of enhancing the community engagement for public-private partnerships. And the focus of this guide is basically to encourage transparency and trust. And they have used several principles which are identified on the right side of this slide, such as identifying who are the communities whom we need to send the messages. We have to make the message very specific, customized to the context and the sentiments of the communities. Start the engagement process very early, and clarity of message, demonstrating accountability, and using the best method of engagement. And a lot of different methods of engagement at different stages of the public-private partnership have been recommended. And this is a very interesting handbook. But for today's seminar, I would leave it at this stage because this is something we already know about, and a lot of us have been practicing some of the recommendations offered in this guide. So I will move over to the story that we have woven in terms of taking a very different perspective on community engagement. Next, please. So let me start with two very basic observations. The first observation is, as Manvai also mentioned, that the resistance and opposition to projects, whether they are in public sector or private sector or in public-private partnership, has been growing across the world. Is there anything wrong with it? No, because a lot of this opposition is on fair grounds, I would say. And therefore, we thought that instead of taking a communication-based engagement perspective on communities and public-private partnership, we will take the perspective of fairness and justice. And as you would recall from the early thinkers, that both fairness and justice are very judgment-based concepts. And it becomes very difficult in order to satisfy um, different constituents of the society in terms of what is fair and what is justifiable. At the same time, the challenge on the other side, or the practical challenge on the other side, is that the negative publicity about failed or underperforming or disruptive public-private partnership project dilutes the public trust in public-private partnerships. And as the trust erodes, it becomes more difficult to garner support for new public-private partnership projects. Once the trust is broken, it is also very difficult to restore it. There are many different researches which have said that the trust can break down in one day and it may take decades to rebuild it. The second observation that I would like to share is that it is very difficult to change negative perceptions of communities, natives of the area where the project is being implemented in the later stages of the public-private partnership projects. And to the extent what we are, our view is that the engagement and participation should start with the development vision itself, no matter where this development vision is originating, whether it's coming from international institutions, federal government, state government. The process of engagement and participation of direct and indirect communities should start in terms of acceptance of the development vision. Next, please. So in order to develop our own thinking and our own storyline on enhancing the engagement and participation, we asked two very basic questions: that why increasing number of people are resisting and opposing public-private partnership infrastructure projects particularly. We don't see much opposition to PPP projects in the field of health. We do not see a high level of opposition in public-private partnership infrastructure projects in the field of education. But one can, in a very simplistic term, say that infrastructure projects, which have very complicated economic characteristics, and also acquisition aspects, acquisition in terms of land, etc., have a particular meaning to the communities, the natives, and the indigenous people who are owners of the land. And our second question was that if we do accept that there has to be resistance and opposition, then what should we do in a very positive way? What proactive strategies and actions on the part of principals? So principals here include all the direct and indirect partners in the public-private partnerships, which can eliminate underlying causes for resistance and opposition. We have used the word eliminate in our question, but I can tell you from practical experience that it's not ever going to be possible to eliminate underlying causes for resistance and opposition against infrastructure public-private partnership projects, because things change dramatically on the ground, and to the extent that new fears and new perceptual risks are perceived by the communities. As a result of that, it's an ongoing process. So we are really looking at a dynamic problem which requires a proactive and a dynamic solution. So let's see what are some of our observations based on these two questions. Next, please. Okay, so there can be many causes. Sometimes these are collective responses of the communities. Sometimes they could be individual reasons, but fundamentally what we found was that in many cases, people do not buy in the development vision. So what is the problem with the development vision? Experience tells us that the development vision is often crafted by people who are not part of the reality or the context. I mean, this development vision could be crafted by global institutions. It could be developed by regional development institutions, federal government, state government, and many cases, of course, in the past, they used to take a techno-economic view, but increasingly based on the recommendations of the World Bank, many project planners started to take a social, anthropological, including political view in terms of enriching the development process. However, we find that because we are now talking in terms of multiple generation, there could be plenty of ideological differences which can reduce the buy-in for the development vision, which may be in the form of a top-down approach. So this is one main cause that we thought we need to address. The second cause that we found was that people do not share the purpose of the public-private partnership project. And often the purpose may be for the benefit of the partners and less for those who are going to be the so-called beneficiary within quotes, including those who are affected by the public-private partnership project in terms of the location of the project. And the purpose is, again, a very complex construct in the theory of, I would say, strategic management to some extent, or even enterprise as a citizen of society. These are emerging disciplines. And if the purpose is not wide enough, if it does not address the well-being and the life of the people, and if the purpose is mainly commercial and or developmental purpose with a very limited boundaries, then obviously there is a scope for conflict amongst the indirect stakeholders, people on the ground. The third cause that we identified was that often the public-private partnership strategy is flawed and it does not serve the interest of the people. And the flawed strategy could be on account of lack of research, particularly market research, I would say, not being able to understand that how the demands of the public are changing, not being able to understand that what are the limitations in terms of the affordability of the services of the infrastructure project, not being able to understand that how different segments in the user community are going to use the infrastructure project, the services of the infrastructure project. And therefore, when there is excessive focus on building based on techno-economic feasibility and the business strategy is weak, we find once again people are going to not fully subscribe to the services offered by the principles of the public-private partnership. The fourth cause is a very interesting cause, and what we are seeing in the recent times is, and it's almost becoming a global phenomena, that different segments of the society are now even reacting to the choice of the private partners. Whether these are individual owners of the private companies or these are private companies. And if they have had a record of unethical practices, then we have seen several protests movements in many different countries. So again, a pointer that we need to pay a lot of attention to the choice of the private partners for the public-private partnership. Go back, please. Yeah. The fifth cause that we found was the disturbance and the disruption caused by reckless construction. And this is particularly true in domains where the ecological balance is very, very fragile. So we'll talk about this as well. And then, of course, this whole element of inefficient operations and what happens when the business model is based on service fee collection, and as the cost goes up, the fee goes up, and people begin to reject the services. This particularly happens in the case of highway projects. And I've also seen this happening in the context of water projects. So, of course, there are many other causes, but we thought that we would address these some very fundamental causes. And also, given my own background in the field of enterprise as an aspect of society and strategic management, I felt more comfortable selecting these 6 causes for lack of engagement and participation by people, or put it in reverse way, opposition and resistance, than many other factors which have been already observed in the research. Next, please. So let's go a little deeper into each of these. These are 2 very interesting stories. On the left side, you have members of local communities embracing trees because this is in the part of Himalayan foothills, and the ecology is very, very fragile. And the local people did not want that in the name of development, their ecosystem should be destroyed. So they started embracing trees. And I would say that this particular protest has been pretty successful, at least in terms of influencing the thinking of the development planners and also the the owners and the principles behind various PPP projects or even non-PPP projects. On the right side, you have a very interesting, very controversial project. This is from UK, Heathrow third runway. Sometimes it is shown green light, sometimes it is shown orange light, sometimes it is shown red light. And once again, the climate change, you can call them activists, but believe me, I do not have a negative connotation attached to the word activist, as many um, political leaders in recent times have started to associate very negative stereotypes with the activists. I feel that activists can play a very, very important role in the society. So these are just representative stories. And if you go around the world, you will find hundreds of these kind of stories where on ideological grounds, there is lack of engagement, lack of participation by the people. So what are our recommendations? Next, please. Yeah, so just to conclude on the short commentary that I made, uh, fundamentally what we're saying is that the local communities and also extended communities, particularly the younger generation, when it comes to climate change, they do not buy in the top-down development for the region. So what are some of the engagement strategies? One, we would suggest that we should involve Native people in developing the development plan itself. Regional development plan uh, has a better, I would say, characterization if we take into account the wisdom of the native people, or sometimes called the wisdom of the tribe, because they have been living in these areas for generations, and the kind of insights that they have about the fragility of their context is not necessarily known to the planners who take a more engineering and a scientific view of everything, because the context is goes much beyond the technology, engineering, and science. It has sociological connotations. It has the connotation in terms of how people carve their life out of natural resources, and if we destroy the equilibrium and the balance in the context, and how their life can be disturbed. So benefiting from the wisdom of the tribe is a very important principle that we need to focus on. Also, we should start thinking in terms of finding appropriate trade-offs, because if there is an ideological difference, it doesn't mean that we don't need to undertake development for the region. Development is a necessity for improving the life of people. Uh, Equally important is the traditions, the anthropological and the sociological traditions that have been evolving over a period of time. So the suggestion here is that we should be able to find appropriate trade-offs between the benefits of the project, the risk, and the aspirations of the native people or the communities. And the fourth recommendation is an ideology-based or a philosophy-based recommendation, where we want to say that people should be seen as partners in development, that both the development plan as well as the specific projects should take into account the voices, the wisdom, and the views, the fears of the communities in terms of design and scale. Next, please. We talked about the misdirected purpose. This is a very interesting story. It's about a Korean company called POSCO. Many of you would know about it. As you can see, Korea is the leading builder of ships, and they wanted to The purpose of this project, which is in the form of iron ore and exploitation of ore mining and a steel mill in the eastern part of India. And for POSCO, the purpose was security in steel sourcing, improving their competitiveness because the ore was easily extractable. And of course, there was a financial interest. And for Korea, it was the interest was more in terms of geopolitical interest, reduce carbon emissions by making steel in somebody else's backyard. And the project was signed in 2005 because the government wanted to showcase it as a beautiful case of foreign direct investment. And through various struggles, it was finally abandoned in 2018 because it was simply not serving the purpose of the local communities. And that's what we call as a public-private partnership project in which the purpose is misdirected. So what is our recommendation here? Next, please. Yeah. So first of all, we need to mitigate the existential risk faced by the native people because of the public-private partnership projects. And why there was a protest and struggle? Because the indigenous people and the local people, they were losing the ownership rights on their ancestral farming lands, which was going to threaten their lifeline. And of course, the activists and some of the local political leaders also played an important role in this. So recommendations in terms of successful practices elsewhere, implement simultaneous land reclamation and redistribution programs. So invest in building social infrastructure for the local communities and promote local tier and tier 3, tier 2 and tier 3 supplier infrastructures to create training and employment opportunities for the local people. As you will see that many of these recommendations are going beyond a simple communication package for engagement. This is what we call as active economic and sociological engagement process. In other words, engagement is not a communication-based construct. Engagement is much deeper and wider than that. And if engagement lacks the continuity in the survival limits of the indigenous people and the local people, there is bound to be a lot of opposition for the public-private partnership. Next, please. Very interesting example of a airport in one of the South Asian countries, dubbed as world's emptiest airport. Now here you can see that the business strategy of the public-private partnership project is flawed. The story of the airport is sometimes it's a government project, sometimes it's a PPP project, sometimes it's classified as a international investors project. So things are changing all the time because there was fundamentally a faulty business strategy behind this whole project. And then on the right side, you have some empirical data in terms of 3 highway projects where these highway projects had to be reconfigured several times, and each time they were reconfigured, the project cost went up and the revenue model was based on toll-free collection. And so this becomes a cost price inflationary trap. The higher the cost, greater will be the fee the users will be required to pay, and greater will be the resistance to the use of services. And this empirical data is from 3 highways in Greece. Next, please. So what can we do in order to ensure that our business strategy is robust and we are able to engage sufficient number of users so that the public-private partnership project is viable? Uh, uh, Involve the end users in the concept and design stages, because once again, we might have a misconception that what is an infrastructure project? Why would people's preferences will change in relation to the infrastructure project? So the question is valid, but the fact of the matter is that as the notion of urban life is changing, and we've seen it how it has changed in terms of future of work and urban living during the pandemic, often the preferences with regard to the use of infrastructure services will also change. So we need to develop a community-based ecosystem which will around the project, which will provide high level of flexibility and make the project uh, somewhat independent of its financial survival based on service fee collection. In other words, creating alternate revenue streams by expanding the framework of the infrastructure project. Focus on all aspects of the service value chain. That will also ensure that we are not tied up with only one kind of a revenue stream, which is the fee to be paid by the users. And then, of course, continuous service innovations to align with changing needs and preferences. So I won't hesitate at all by saying that maybe the public-private partnership should have very strong understanding of the user behavior and should also start developing a marketing mindset in order to ensure that they have a very dynamic kind of a offering in order to make the project successful and also help the users to overcome the resistance to usage of the services offered. Next, please. I talked about unethical partners and private companies for the sake of preserving the reputation. I've not given specific names, but if you do a little bit of search, you will find that there are many different campaigns which are going against enterprises as well as individuals. And fundamentally, their business practices are questionable. What are our recommendations here? Next, please. Obvious thing to say, select credulous private partners with impeccable image, follow transparent mechanisms, and you could as well be involving some third-party non-governmental organizations like Oxfam to do a little bit of social audit of these private partners before you bring them into the play. The leadership team should adopt a charter of commitments to the society. It's very, very rare for the PPP principles to adopt a commitment to the charter of commitment to the society, but time has come now. And carry out annual social audit of the public-private partnership through third-party, not-for-profit organizations. So you might have seen the social audit report of some private global companies. So this is the time when public-private partnership should also start communicating directly with the public in terms of a third-party certification of their ethical practices, particularly the social and anthropological impact of these projects on the society. Next, please. Reckless construction. This is something which is very, very disturbing. And maybe sometime later, Max, if we have time, we can play this video. Are you able to play this video? Yeah. Is there a voiceover?
हमारा गांव एकदम जैसे आपदा जैसी स्थिति में है इस समय। हमारी रोड भी जो गांव की लिंक रोड थी वो उसके नीचे से भी कटिंग हुई तो रोड भी टूट चुकी है।
जो एनएच वाले जो रोड काट रहे हैं इनको हमका बहुत नुकसान हो रहा है, क्योंकि हमारे जो नहरें हैं, खेती है, ये जो खेत हैं, रास्ते हैं, इन्होंने जो है पूरा नुकसान, पूरा बह गया, हमारा पूरा रास्ता टूट रखा। हमारा एक रास्ता यहाँ नीचे आता है, भिंगार की ग्राम सभा बोलते हैं इधर सामने, वहाँ भी एक लड़की मलमा आया वो दब गई वहाँ पर।
Large volumes of muck being generated, and it has been haphazardly dumped because there was no EIA sought before the project was started. No such sites were identified beforehand. Now boards are being put up wherever the muck was dumped, saying these are muck dumping sites. There is rules which specify that in the mountains the road can be at maximum 8.8 meters wide with a shoulder 9.8 meters. In many places the road has been cut up to 30 meters. Okay. It's not going to last.
All-weather road, it's a fooling thing, and it will not sustain in the mountains, because in the mountains you are making the roads on the fills, you are making the roads on the rocks, you are making the roads on the even on the subsided landslides. Or older landslides. So every 100 meters in the mountains, it's a different landscape, it is different substrata. And if you make a uniform policy, if you make a uniform code for making the roads in the mountains all together from Rishikesh to Kedarnath, it's not going to work there.
The faster the pilgrimage, the less people stop en route, and they don't contribute anything to the local economies. They don't stay at chattis, they don't eat at the dhabas. Locally, I do not think it is going to contribute anything at all other than a carbon footprint for the community.
It's all right, because the audio is in Hindi. Yeah, Max, can we move to the next slide? Message is clear. So those were some very disturbing visuals that you have seen. And here is an interesting point, that no matter how good are the intentions of the principles, but when it comes to doing work at the ground level, the third party or the fourth party contractors are often so reckless in terms of how they execute the project. And if you do not have the eyes on the ground as principals, you will be disturbing the ecology and the sociological aspects of the environments, and that is going to create a huge backlash against the project and the nature of ownership of the project. So basically what is required here is that the time has come to undertake very detailed environmental and ecological impact studies throughout various stages of the PPP by involving local inhabitants, because they know what it means to live in those conditions. Continuous social and anthropological impact of the project. Now, we do have a practice of social impact, but normally it is done before the project is implemented, funded, and sometimes it is done after 4 or 5 years. Our recommendation is that it has to become a continuous process. Because project should be seen as a dynamic entity and not as a fixed kind of a structure standing in the context of the society. Select appropriate construction scale, design, and method. So that's a technical recommendation. One doesn't have to be very ambitious about building huge projects. You have to take into account the equilibrium principle, and any life-disrupting risks involved must be mitigated, although it may be difficult under many circumstances. Next, please. These are, again, as we were saying earlier, that in the context of water and infrastructure projects, we see huge amount of rejection of the product and the services by the users, potential users, and this is very, very common across the developing and developed world. So 2 examples from Africa, one from Africa, one from Indonesia. So what are our recommendations? And under what circumstances the projects become inefficient? Next, please. So first of all, we need to understand the socio-economic conditions of the people, particularly the user classes, and try to reduce the business risk by choosing appropriate technologies and the scale. And third one is a fairly standard idea: reduce the inefficiencies and control operating costs through cost audit on continuous basis. Adopt flexible pricing strategy and regulate the price. Now, we know that in non-performing public-private partnerships, how the risks are continuously transferred to the private party, and from the private party, the burden has to be borne by the users. And that's exactly the point here, that why should the user become the victim for the inefficiencies created by the project principles? That's the fundamental question here. And that needs to be answered. So it's a much larger question, even larger than what the perspective that I'm presenting here in terms of how to improve the usage of a particular public-private partnership in electricity, water, and highways. Next, please. So we are going beyond, holding these public talks and media campaigns and sort of town hall meetings, standard prescriptions you will find. We think that there is a need for principles to constitute multiple platforms for consultations and arbitration. And we have identified at least 5 other categories of representatives who should be made part of the PPP project along with the principals. And these are the bodies representing the natives and the communities. The media is very important these days. We all know it. Independent social audit organizations, science and technology schools, and of course the users. And this should actually represent the key organization culture of the public-private partnership called consultation and arbitration. And it is becoming more and more important as people have shown their um, social energy to exercise their rights. So it's very important that we change and adopt a more societal kind of organization culture inside the public-private partnership than a simple commercial organization-based approach to doing it. Next, please. So just to conclude, in terms of some of these very broad present recommendations that we have made, one, accept people as partners in the development agenda and the strategy. The project should have a wider purpose for the society and not just a pure return on investment or a commercial purpose. Business strategy should focus on balancing social, commercial, and economic value creation. And the economic value creation comes from multiple revenue streams and selection of ethical and credulous private partners, accountability, continuous accountability through social audits, strict construction protocols, properly audited by third-party experts, focus on efficient delivery of services, and at least not transfer the commercial risks to the users. And most importantly, build trust and resolve conflict of interest through multi-party consultative and audit mechanisms. So these are some of the observations and recommendations that I thought I will share with you. And as I said in the beginning, this is a much fundamental perspective on public-private partnership, and it extends the theory of engagement, which is purely based on communication and consultation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Before I throw it to the all the participants who will be able to raise questions, I think it's by raising your hand, and then Max will allow you in for the questioning. And also, you may also type in from the chat, right? So, but before I open it up, I take the advantage to ask the first question, Professor.
Yes.
I noticed in your presentation, you also talk about negative public perception, which I can appreciate that, particularly in the area that we are working in here in Hong Kong.
Yes.
We are facing quite a lot of difficulties, particularly in terms of perception. And I also noticed very interestingly, you talk about this community-based ecosystem, which it actually hit me very, very deeply, because this particular ecosystem of community-based approach, I think, can have some impact, particularly for those of us who are wanting to push forward some sort of meaningful PPP projects. Any chance that you can elaborate a little bit on this, or with your experience on this sort of ecosystem formation? Yeah.
So first talk about the correction of public perception. There is no research study, but it's my hunch that the return on investment on changing public perception is not very attractive. Therefore, it is better to improve your return on investment by doing the right things at the project level, so that you don't have to cope with the barrage of negative public messaging on the social media. And you can do it in terms of extrapolating the organization philosophy, the purpose, the culture, and the organization architecture in alignment with the changing aspirations of the society. Now, talking about the ecosystem, the societal ecosystem, So there are some very interesting studies that how the fragmentation of the large um, metropolises is going on. Something very interesting. Several friends of mine during the pandemic found that living in London was becoming extremely challenging. So at least 4 of my friends have moved out to smaller cities like Henley and including Oxford. So what we are seeing here is that there is some kind of a reclustering of urban habitats which is happening. And what kind of societal ecosystem is emerging is something which people are now driving, not the developers. In the past, it used to be the developers who will drive that who will live where and when and how much kind of a thing. But today we are seeing that people who have the means are exercising their choices. And they're not necessarily guided by the fact that if they are in London, they have the tube and they have all the beautiful restaurants and the educational institutions, etc., etc. With a lot of technology coming into our life in terms of shopping, education, health delivery, we find that people are quite happy to enjoy the beautiful semi-urban, semi-rural kind of environment to live in. So that is what I meant by understanding that what is the new pattern of human habitation which is happening and which is going to happen in the next 20 years. The kind of demand that you see today may not actually be there in the next 20 years. Often we have seen that a lot of projects are located based on what is called the constituency preferences of the political leaders, which again totally ignores the society, because the political leader wants to do something in order to earn the gratitude of his electorate, not knowing that the commercial viability and the ecosystem viability of that project is highly questionable. So those were some of the points that I was highlighting in making those observations.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the floor? Anyone that want to raise question? You just raise your hand, and then Max will allow you in. There's one Q&A. I find one from Giles. Professor Lalit, great presentation. Thank you. Does the definition of public include the UN, DFIs, semi-government organizations that are becoming more active in this space? Giles Gunaskara asking this question.
Yes. So Oxfam has now Oxfam has developed a new expertise where they undertake the social audit of private organizations, and they have a very strong public image, and any social audit report coming from a third party, credible, trusting NGO has a huge impact on the mindset of the people. So instead of fighting endless wars on social media in terms of presenting your own position, it is better to pay a small amount of fee to a third party credible NGO and get the social audit done. And this, I think, is going to be a very important business opportunity for many organizations. I've also seen that in some companies, they have started inviting activists to their board meetings. Because, the word activism is not a negative word. The voice of the activist, honest activist, I would say, can often provide a lot of new opportunities to the investors, as well as those who are seeking new business opportunities.
Okay, I got another question. It's from the chat room. It's from Harold. In the context of waste management facilities in Hong Kong, there's significant NIMBY objection the key problem is a drop in value of the stakeholders' residential property, which has a waste facility in its backyard. I don't know whether you want to answer that or that's just a comment. All right.
Yeah, actually, it goes back to creating alternate revenue streams for the public-private partnership. So the narrower is the source of revenue for the public-private partnership, greater would be the pressure on the users and higher will be the resistance. So what can a waste management company in Hong Kong do? Um, in fact, we have many students from my program in that company there. And how do we go beyond a narrow definition of waste management? That's a big question for them.
Yes.
You know.
Okay, another question from Billy. My questions for Professor Lalit is from your study on main causes of public resistance to PPP. Is there any major difference between developed countries and developing countries? This is from Billy. Billy
There
Tam.
is, yeah. So there are some differences. We find that there is greater degree of resistance to price of electricity and water in the developing countries, whereas mega projects invite huge amount of pushback from the society in the advanced countries. And it all depends on the levels of awareness. I won't say education, but now what we are seeing is that the awareness about climate change and need to do something about climate change is rising dramatically across the world. And this is the time when the policymakers will benefit a great deal in terms of identifying that what are some of the top trends in terms of the activist agenda. What are the key messages that they are trying to deliver to the society?
Yes.
And that is where you can identify the contextuality of the message from the activists, as well as the natural commercial resistance to the public-private partnership. So we are basically talking in terms of ideology-based opposition versus opposition to the commercial aspects of the public-private partnership. And on the third side, we are talking in terms of the risk to the lifeline. So all these three should be taken together.
Okay, thank you. There's another one from Stuart Gilchrist of UAsia Hong Kong, urban planners and tourism planners. His question is, have you considered any tools that could be applied to address community concerns about PPP and ensure that projects represent these adequately? And he's thinking of tools such as those developed by Planet Happiness,
yes,
part of the Happiness Alliances, which uses a happiness index to supplement GDP as a measure of well-being. Recognized by OECD and UN, is currently applied to tourism destinations, but can have a wider application using big data to measure and illustrate community vulnerability and what the aspiration of the community are. Simple to use, it could be used to help PPP projects more relevant to those local communities affected. So this is your area, right, Professor?
Absolutely. This is a brilliant observation, real state of the art. And I would definitely encourage people to use so-called even artificial intelligence-based tools. We are trying one here in terms of what is the impact of low budget tourism on certain habitats here in Thailand, particularly impact on the marine life. And with the combination of empirical data-based intelligence as well as artificial intelligence, it is possible to develop some decisional templates which can form part of the tool. And I think that's the future of planning. The future of planning is not just about designing the biggest project or a project which has a commercial viability. You have to think beyond that.
Okay, thank you. I have one question from Mohan Kumar Rasmami, and he wants to turn on the mic to talk, right, Kumar? Maybe Max, you can allow him in to talk. Max?
Okay.
Kumar, you can start talking.
Thank you, MW. Professor Jory, I wonder whether you can hear me?
I can.
Great. This is based on your very interesting observation that few people are wanting to move out and have moved out of London. I believe this is to be expected, and even in other big cities. Now, there may be a trend which reverses previous trends towards urbanization. We might have something like a little bit of de-urbanization. But what I'm coming to is smart cities. I mean, there was a big trend towards doing smart cities, but again, I think the definition and scope of smart cities will change from more IT type smartness to more livable, safe, and convenient, which is why your friends were moving out. So my question is, since the government sector can't do this on their own, the public sector, isn't this a golden opportunity for the private and public sectors to pool their resources in developing the new type of smart, and I'm not just talking about city now, even the rural infrastructure, because this is the classic reason for bringing the public and private together to pool their resources and compensate the weaknesses of the other. So as you know, one of the students, PhD students of Dr. Daniel Chan and is supervising Nimesh, and I'm co-supervising, is working on this. But I just want to get your observation now on whether you think there's scope for public and private sectors to come together to develop the new concept, the new normal smart in context of cities and even rural infrastructure. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, again, a very interesting question. Thank you, Mohan. And thank you for your emails prior to the webinar. I have a very mixed view on smart cities because they have remained a non-starter. There are few exceptional small level projects which in Singapore and South Korea, which can be called as smart because the focus of the smart city was more in terms of accessibility to the policy planners and the decision makers, the use of information technology and efficient services, etc., etc. And it has not really happened at a very large scale. And to the extent that I would rather have vibrant cities instead of smart cities, because a city is a living entity. City is not a machine which runs on the flow of information and the use of technology. I mean, it is all right for the purpose of creating an investment portfolio and a public image for your enterprise, to use a term like smart. It has been in vogue for almost about 10 years now, but we really don't see any smart aspect of any city, no matter whether you are in a developed country or in a developing country. So anyway, Shakespeare said, what's in a name? Let's continue to use in terms of the spirit of the word smart. I completely agree. There is a definite opportunity, and in fact, the smart cities will materialize faster in semi-rural, semi-urban communities as compared to the legacy-loaded, large, traditional urban cities. I mean, you ask your friends in Hong Kong, as you must be visiting because part of your job in Hong Kong, PolyU and the university. Hong Kong is in a gridlock. The life in Hong Kong is so tightly bound to so many systems that there is very little degree of freedom left. except to go and create a new island on the sea. So what can you do in terms of smartness? You can lay down the information technology pipelines. You can make the information flow better, but can you improve the quality of life of the people? That is something I'm sure you would be asking in the class. So, but your observation is absolutely valid that you can create a very vibrant life if you are in a sort of city which has certain degree of equilibrium. London city doesn't have uh, equilibrium, to be honest.
Thank you, Professor. I think we are slightly overrun already, but I think I can take one or two more questions. And one question is from Felix Lee. And he just thanked Professor for his interesting presentation. I'd like to have his view and suggestion on how to implement infrastructure PPP project, such a high-speed rail that has run over a number of countries, so that with huge land intake from local communities, but also benefit more for the country across countries. So it's not just a locality, it's across country.
Yeah.
So view on that, yeah.
Another very good question. And as you know that activists against the high-speed HS2 in UK have been chaining themselves to the tracks at the Euston railway station in London. And my good friend who's on the panel today, Billy himself, is running a high-speed train project here in Thailand. His company, China Railways, is given the task of building that. The experience, if you take the experience from Japan, there is a positive side and there is a negative side. In Japan, what has happened is that the bullet train has benefited the terminal ends as well as certain intermediate stations, the regions around the intermediate stations, right? But it has not necessarily led to the same degree of development through the regions through which the passage of the tracks follows. Now, that's a good thing in the sense that you're not disturbing the nature and the sort of ecological equilibrium of the whole country. From the development perspective, you can say, are you not creating an inequality? In the sense that if you are linking Tokyo with Kyoto, you're helping Kyoto and Tokyo. What about the intermediate level regions? What about them? So I think this is a very difficult choice. When you run a high-speed train, you cannot afford to invest in multiple intermediate positions because the economics of the high-speed train will not work out sufficiently, as has been proven in Japan. And exactly the same thing happening in France also. I mean, you have very, I won't say poor regions. As soon as the tunnel enters France, you could be in regions which look pretty much like the rural scenario. But when you are in London, you are far, far away from that kind of a rural scene. When you are either in Brussels or in Paris, again, you have a very different kind of the perception of development. So I think it's a given fact of the high-speed rail projects that the terminal ends tend to benefit more than the intermediate.
Thank you, Professor. I just want to try one last one. It's from our president, Walter. He said, agree to establish genuine relationships with the community is fundamental and important, but how to balance the interests of the wider community with the local community? Is effective engagement just communication? Just the question.
So one of the recommendation is when we were talking about the Korean steel company project in eastern part of India, POSCO, that of course POSCO lost several $billions in the project that they had to abandon. What was needed was a variety of solution. I mean, their whole solution was that they will give one job to each member of the family. They will pay some compensation for the land. That was not adequate. That was very transactional kind of a solution. Because the whole idea of iron ore mining and steel project was to transform the steel supply chain for POSCO and Korea. So the local communities also need a transformational solution, not a transactional solution.
Mm.
Now, we have made those transformational recommendations. For example, creation of tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers for the maintenance of the steel plant, supply of the machines. So in other words, if you are investing $1 billion in a steel plant and $1 billion in developing a mine, so you have a $2 billion investment, it's worth investing another billion in developing a tertiary infrastructure, which will become a kind of which will be aligned to the two core projects. So that is what we are seeing. So the principle here is, if you are seeking transformational benefits from a region, you need to deliver back transformational effects to that region and not transactional compensation.
Thank you very much, Professor. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I must say apology for those who may not be able to have the questions answered. But this is the end of this session. May I express our sincere thanks to Professor Lalit Jory, and also to the organizing team of the IPPP also. And not last but not least, to ATO Engineering Group for the sponsorship. So I like to see you all in our next webinar. Just for some sort of advertising for that is we will hold another one on the 25th of March, 2021, 2 p.m. Beijing time, which is also Hong Kong time. The language will be, I think, Mandarin, Putonghua and bilingual, I think, and will be also by Zoom and free for entry. So stay tuned for that, all right? And goodbye and have a good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Bandwai. Thank you, all
Thank
the
you.
friends and participants. Thank you, Walter. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.